Today we're on to welcome Jan Raeder to the show today. I'm very excited to have her on. She talks about some very interesting topics, right? And today we're going to walk away with practical takeaways that are going to be able to transform our lives. And she's an author, a speaker, and basically, when we talk about healthcare, there's so much that goes into that, right? But today we're going to learn about Jane's insights and her story to really transform our life today. So I'm very excited to have her on. How you doing today, Jan?
I'm so glad to be here. I'm really excited about our conversation today.
Yeah, very happy to have you here. So also very curious to hear your story and how you got into the space that you're in and healthcare being of service today.
Well, I guess if we can put my story in a nutshell, which would be a pretty big nutshell, unfortunately,
Yeah.
I have a very eclectic background. The majority of my background, though, is in traditional Okinawan Japanese karate. I have over 30 years in that. I'm retired now. I retired in 2018. I went back to college late in life, and I wound up getting a bachelor's and a master's within 4 years. Side note, I started with only 19 credits when I went back, and that I attribute that being able to do that to the self-discipline that I learned in martial arts. Plus, I'm a pretty intense person when it comes to certain things like that. So when I got back to higher education, I was in a non-traditional school that worked with people that were going back to school later in life, and the person I was working with was like, "Well, what do you think about being a coach, a health coach?" And I thought, "Okay, no, not really," but I decided that I would become a coach to coaches, and so I developed a certificate program to be used in higher education for people that wanted to be health coaches, because at that time there wasn't really a lot of legitimate programs out there online.
Hmm.
And then I taught a course about well-being theory at a local university, and then the pandemic happened. So then I decided, what can I do during the pandemic? So I wrote a book. And my book is based on that course that I taught, because people loved it. They wanted me to come back, but I had things going on in my personal life with my mom, and I couldn't go back even virtually. Um, so I wrote the book, and and that's kind of what brings us here today. A little bit about that is to share about my book and to hopefully enrich your audience with some of the skills that I teach in my book, because improving your life and living a life worth living, one that you feel is worth living, because we're talking about subjective well-being, it's doable. There are things that you can do, and science shows that there are things that you can easily do to improve that. There it is in a nutshell.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. I mean, so it sounds like you got into martial arts, you kind of learned a lot from that, but then you kind of transitioned over into health coaching. Is that right?
um so I don't know. Everything sort of blends for me together. Like as far as how I kind of went from martial arts to what I'm doing now, everything ties in together. Um, like I say to most people when I have a conversation with people, we're all going to come up against crossroads in our lives. We're all going to have something that's going to happen. It's part of the human experience. Um, People get a diagnosis, they lose a loved one, they maybe lose a job, their relationship crashes, and then, their path changes. So just like that, that's been kind of my experience too.
Yeah.
I've received a diagnosis, and then what happens when you get on later in life is, and I think it can happen younger too, but you'll stop and you look in the mirror and you go, okay, what do I do now? And who am I now? And so that's kind of where things start to change. You can either lay down and give up, or you can shift and make a change in your path.
Yeah. Well, I love that. I mean, as you mentioned, like we all have like these crossroads, right? In a sense, and like we have to decide how we're going to show up in that moment. Like,
Yeah.
what path are we going to choose? I mean, often I like to say you're going to be a victim or a victor of the circumstances, right?
Right.
And a lot of times, choosing the path of empowerment and the path of freedom, that's going to be not only the more fulfilling thing, but it's going to be a harder thing up front, right? And
Yeah.
those moments forge your character, I believe.
Yeah. Well, I like the word, you mentioned a victim. I like to think of ourselves, I'd rather have people think of them as being the victor instead of the
Yeah,
victim.
yeah,
Because, it's a choice. You have the choice to decide how you're going to react to the things that happen to you. And I think what we're talking about ultimately is building resilience. And when I say resilience, and I mentioned the word building, you have to build that resilience, to choose that path to show up in the best way possible. You've got to do work ahead of time. You've got to do things to be able to do that. So I think that's a lot of what people need to learn is how to be more resilient, and it's possible. Even if you feel like the weight of your circumstances are so heavy, the weight of the challenge you're facing is so heavy, you still can get to the other side. You can't just lay there when the truck runs over you. You can't just lay there and go, okay. You have to actually find a way to get up and start over again. And I think that's kind of what we're talking about here. Hopefully that's what we're talking about here.
yeah. That's what I mentioned. It's like be a victim or a victor, and that's a choice that we have to decide, right? And I know it's not always easy, right? But we have to make that decision with ourselves, and that's how
Yeah.
we get to the other side of that the hardship, in a sense, and we can start to embrace the challenges and be of service on the other side.
Yeah. I love that you mentioned the word hardship and that it is hard because in with positive psychology and part of the framework that I have developed, uh, what I did just to talk about my framework, it's MORE, M period, O period, R period, E period. And that's actually based on Martin Seligman. He's the father of positive psychology. That's based on his original theory, which is PERMA. And that's, as I mentioned earlier, that I taught in the local college, the well-being theory. It's hard to remember. And people, when I would talk about perma, they have a glazed look over their face like, permafrost? Are you like what? So it was hard to remember. And so I thought, okay, when I was writing my book, I was like, how can I make this easier for people to remember? So it's meaning, optimism, relationships, and engagement. And I like optimism. I chose optimism because of what you said. It's a choice. And that you've got to look at those circumstances and that they're difficult. And that's the thing about optimism. A lot of people, I've had a number of people say to me recently, toxic positivity. And I'm like, is that like Pollyanna? The Pollyanna-ish look at things? I'm dating myself
Right.
when I say Pollyanna. But anyway, optimism is not toxic positivity. Optimism is you recognize that things are tough. You recognize when people come up against those crossroads I mentioned, it isn't easy. But if we embrace the fact that it's difficult and we are going to learn something, that's where everybody grows. When we get challenged, that's when we grow. So if you decide that I'm going to take the best out of this, what can I learn? What am I learning about me? How can I use this going forward? You become a better person with other people too.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense because first we make our habits, then our habits make us, in a sense, right? Because we have to be willing to take these circumstances, as you mentioned, and use it for good, right? Optimize your reality, right? Because a lot of times we look at failure and we just kind of think it's the end of the road in many circumstances. But it's really about learning from it. It's about feedback and not changing the goal, but changing the approach too.
Right. Right, definitely. And I love that you said we have to use it for good because there's and trust me, I'm not I have nothing against people having a pity party, if you will, for themselves when they have tough
Right.
things happen to them. Because for a moment, you do need to do that. You kind of need to go, oh, okay, and you need to kind of digest what's happening. And sometimes, pick the way you like your pity party. Maybe you feel like you got the covers pulled over your head, and I don't want to get out of bed, and but at some point you have to say, okay, I still have to keep living my life. And I still have to, I've got to pick myself up, dust myself off. I've got to figure out what I'm going to do about this. And, what I've heard in the past from some very wise people are the more difficult your past is, the wiser you should be as a person. And I'm thinking that's so much truth to that. And I think what I would think about that additionally is how, when you have these adversity things, how are you going to choose to show up, and how are you going to choose to grow, and what are you going to take from that experience to learn? That's in where the failures and where the hardships push you forward, is how you look at them, your perspective of how you look at them. But I love also what you said about that you kind of have to have habits. You got to do these things ahead of time. I share
Exactly.
8 exercises in my book that are, they're free to do after you purchase the book. But once you read them and you start doing them, you're building those habits. You're building that so that when the hardship slaps you in the face, you're prepared, or more prepared anyway. It depends on the hardship, obviously.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, our perspective can really become our reality, right? It's like how we look at things are really important. Like, when we change the way we look at things, the things we look at change, right? Because we look at things in a certain way, and we just kind of like we see it as like almost of like a fixed state or a fixed mindset, and we never see a way out. And again, it's not that the solution doesn't exist; it's that we're not receptive to it based on our current paradigm. So it's kind of shift the internal questions that we ask, and all these types of things that kind of lead to external results too.
Right. Yeah, you're so right with how we see things. And going back to science, the way that our brains are wired, we are hardwired for negativity. It's a survival skill. It's part of our survival. We still need it. Obviously we still need it now to avoid danger and so on and so forth. But when you think about the human evolution, everybody's read stories about times with cavemen and so on and so forth. Don't eat that because you're gonna die if you eat that. Don't go down there because there's an apex predator down there and you could die. So this is that hardwiring that's going on in our brain, which is very important for survival. However, it tends now where we're not, trust me, there are people still on the planet that are facing apex predators. There are. So they still need that hardwiring. And we still do need it to a certain degree. But we also need positivity, and we also need optimism, because those are things that help us collaborate with each other. They help us move forward in a way where we're based now in society. But we always go back to that hard wiring. We always go back to it. So we have to train ourselves to try to stay away from that hard wiring. And that's only done by doing things over and over again from a positive standpoint. So that's where I like the word optimism, because it's a choice. You can keep spiraling down in the negativity, or you can do the things that we know by science will make you elevate, will spiral you upwards into being a more positive person.
Yeah, it kind of sounds like it's more of a balance, right? We have to train our minds. Like, we all have these opportunities throughout our day. Like, there's so many decisions that we get to make, right? And each one of them we can utilize in a sense to train our minds to kind of stay focused on what matters and keep that positivity going, right? But a lot of times we're not aware of that. And I feel like the awareness is the first step to that, because if we're not aware of these things, then how can we actually decide? And we just kind of default to our own programming that has been run for years or decades, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And it's great that you're bringing up awareness and self-awareness. And I've talked to a lot of people. Actually, I spoke to somebody several months ago who, where she actually focuses on awareness. And self-awareness is so, so important. But it doesn't stop there. It's not, it's like once you're aware of something that you're doing or that is happening to you, and you've got to start to have the tools to move forward in a positive way from those things. This is another thing that I talk to about with a lot of people is the relationship we have with ourselves is the longest relationship we're ever going to have. So if you don't build the relationship with yourself, that and I think of life as a train, as a metaphor of a train. People get on and off your train at different stops, but you're on the train for the entire time. So if you don't have a great relationship with yourself, the train ride is not going to be as pleasant as if you are figuring out who you are. So that the fact that you're bringing up awareness, the awareness piece, what's great about that is, and that kind of folds back into one of the other things that I talk about with a lot of people, is taking things too personally. And you, as a martial arts student, you know how it's like. If I'm working with another fellow student and they either hit me hard or do a takedown that's hard, if I take it personal, I'm done. I've lost my focus. And now they're quote unquote winning that exchange of what's going on, and I've lost something there. And the other part of that is I don't know what people are bringing to the table. If I'm not a mind reader, so I don't know what happened to you today, and if you took me down hard or hit me hard on the training mat and I take it personal, it may have 99% of the time it has nothing to do with me. So it may have something to do with you. So that folds back into that awareness. There may be something that happened to you when you were much younger that you told yourself the wrong story, and then now someone's doing something else to you in your life. They're having a conversation or whatever, and you're getting angry, or you're getting upset about that, or you're taking it personally. And you have to be aware to say, gee, why am I doing that? And then you have to do the work to figure out possibly where that came from and like what can I do about it now. So
that makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, the awareness is the first step, right? And it's like a lot of times we take failure personally and just kind of like looking at that, from a life perspective as a whole, we just kind of like, we don't understand like the obstacle is the way. Or we have to start to embrace these things and build resilience, because things are going to happen. I feel like success requires a lot of strength, right? You have to actually be solid in who you are. And a lot of times that is developed through overcoming these things. So kind of like start to embrace it. It's kind of, that's the way I look at it.
Yeah. I mean, when you talk about embracing, can you elaborate a little bit more about what your thoughts are with that?
Yeah. So if we come up against like failures and obstacles, like what I mean is, okay, yeah, this thing happened, right? Now, how can I leverage it to the most, like the utmost optimization in a sense, right? Because instead of like, because we don't embrace it, I feel like now we're just starting being in that victim mindset. But now you start to look at it in a way like, hey, how can I grow from this? Like, how can I learn from this? And how can I maybe get to the other side of it and kind of like, teach other people from the lesson, right?
Right. Okay. That makes a lot of sense to put it in that way, and I think, I guess one of the things that I would share is a personal experience of my own. I have a dear friend that her relative died at a very young age, and they weren't sure whether or not this person took their own life or if it was an accident. It involved a firearm. So she had shared that information with me, and she unfortunately has, it's really been devastating to her, which is completely understandable. I've had people in my life, dear people in my life, that have committed suicide. So I do understand that. So when you talk, and the reason I'm using this example when you're talking about embracing something, and as I mentioned earlier, You're allowed to have that pity party because you have to get through that. But this is now, when we had this conversation, this is many, many years after this had happened. And it was still affecting her very deeply. And I asked her, and maybe some of your listeners might go when I say this, I asked her what the gift of this relative's death was. And at first her face was, what? Gift? How? And you want to get upset about that. And I said, look, take a breath. And I said, think about what happened right after this happened. She said, well, our family came together and we, embraced each other and we were there for each other and so on. I said, yeah, so you started to understand what's important. And then I said, and what do you think of it now? And she was like, I still feel that way about my family and so on. I said, but unfortunately, what's happening is if you switched places with a person who's deceased and you could look in on you now, what you're doing, what would you say as the deceased person? You'd probably say, what are you doing with your life? I want you to be happy. I want you to live. And, the other thing I said to her was, you're dishonoring this person by not living your own life. So when you're talking about embracing, you're going to embrace these tragedies, these terrible things that happen to you, but then you have to transcend them. You have to find some way, especially when you're talking about a death and grief from a death. You have to find some way to honor that person that's missing in your life now. And trust me, this doesn't happen immediately. You need to go through all the stages of grief and so on and so forth. But then you need to transcend the grief. And when we say grief, it's not just always about a person that's died. You can have grief when you lose a job. You can have grief when a relationship ends. I had grief as a athlete when my body failed me. And now all of a sudden I'm not able to do the things that I was doing. And when I had, people say, medical professionals say, oh, well, you could do this. And you can't explain to them, I know, but I am who I am as a martial artist. I now have to redefine myself and I've got to figure that out. So there's grief in so many things, but we want to transcend that grief. Actually, people that start podcasts like yourself, sometimes that's what they're doing. They're transcending something that's happened to them and they want to share their story with someone else, in hopes that maybe what you've gone through is something that can help them when they're going through something.
100%. Yeah, because you said, of course, have your feelings and, do whatever you need to do. But it's like, if we stay there, then we're not really going to transcend it in a sense, right? We have to be able to, we have to look at it, we have to embrace it, then we have to learn, how can I get to the other side and, be of service, because, we have to reach our full potential and we're designed for greatness in a sense. And if we're just stuck, we can't really do that. We can't really do that because, when you start to take action and we start to propel ourselves toward a future, but, with that stagnant energy, nothing really happens. Just being able to stay calm and, kind of learn from these things. It's always a process too, right? All you have is right now. And you have to choose which path you want to take.
100%. And you are absolutely right. It is a process, and a lot of people stay stuck because sometimes what's happening to them feels so overwhelming that they feel there's nowhere to go. And I'm saying this along with people that have suffered tremendous things. And there's a lot of people out there that have suffered tremendous things. And I like to say this, and I don't want anybody to take offense to this, but you're not special. You're not alone. We are all human, and we all are experiencing similar things. The circumstances might not be exactly the same as what you are, but in essence, people are dealing with loss. They're dealing with total change of a career path. They're dealing with maybe I lost a limb and now I have to deal with that. There's tremendous amounts of loss that people have suffered. And so somewhere in there, you can feel you're not alone, even though you feel very alone with what's happening to you, but you're not. It's part of the human experience. And there is a way forward. There's always a way forward. And there's so many people that are wanting to help and wanting to be there to support you. Even when you feel, I don't know if you've ever experienced something where you do feel so alone and you feel like I'm the only one going through this, but you're not. You're not the only one, and there's comfort in that. It's not how somehow invalidating what somebody is going through. What I'm doing is validating it and saying you're not alone. There's plenty of people that have gone through loss and are there for you. So that's part of the message too, is that you're not alone. You're not the only one. And you can make it. You can definitely, even if you feel like you can't, you can take a tiny step forward and you can make it.
Yeah. We have to start to believe in possibility, right? Because if we don't believe something is possible, what actions are we going to take? Probably none, right? Very little, if any. And once we start to believe in possibility, we start to shift our internal questions, like going from a place of disempowerment, like why me and why is this happening, to a place of empowerment. Right? How can I embrace this? How can I learn? How can I grow? How can I get to the other side? And we essentially are going to find what we look for. So if we're stacking the evidence for us, that's going to start to build those positive habits and get those small wins every single day. Right? Just get to the other side of it and make that progress, right? And you start to build that momentum on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. Yep. One of the exercises that I share in my book that I think is one of the most powerful, and it's exactly what you're talking about, some small thing that you can do on a daily basis. And you do it, it's that, like what I mentioned earlier about resilience. It's building that resilience ahead of time. It's a daily practice of building your resilience and building a life that when you look back, that you feel that it was worth living. It's called What Went Well. Actually, I do it every Wednesday on social media. I've been doing it for almost 2 years now. And what it is Martin Seligman and his students actually developed this exercise many years ago. They called it 3 good things, but they also used the term what went well in there. And what you want to think about is every day, think of at least three things, if you can, at least 3 things that went well. And this is not a gratitude list. And I don't have anything against gratitude lists, but the science shows that people can feel that they're tedious. The difference with this exercise is the bigger part of it is, why did that thing go well? Why are you choosing that? Why do you see that that's something you're going to focus on? Now, when I say this could be a small thing. Your significant other brought home your favorite ice cream for you. And why was that great? Because you never asked them. They just brought it home. Somebody that you work with that never speaks to you said good morning. Why was that great? Because they never speak to you normally, and somehow they've made it a little bit of a connection. So these are the little tiny things that you want to notice. And what happens is you then start looking for things. You start looking for the positive little things. So the story that I shared about the person whose relative had died. Okay, what went well with that? Our family got closer. Why was that good? Well, because maybe we didn't realize how important what really was important, which is our connection, our bond, the way we interact with one another. So as you do this daily, when your life is just going on the way it normally does, that's where you're building that muscle, if you will, of optimism and looking for it. And that's the meaning piece, the why. Because when the truck runs over you and you don't want to get up, you have to find the meaning of why you would want to get up. And it's got to be tangible. And your reason, Anthony, for getting up is possibly completely different than my reason for getting up. Because right. Each of us we have overarching connections with meaning. You know, we all seem to admire things and know that there's something greater than ourselves. All of these overarching kind of things that everybody finds meaningful. Most people, if I asked you, do you want to have a happy life? I have never heard somebody say to me, no, I don't. I want to be miserable for my entire life. So these are things that everybody agrees is meaningful. But then we get down into the nuances. What do you find meaningful? So you have to find the tangible, meaningful things in your life so that when the truck pulls off of you and you're laying there looking up at the ceiling, you go, okay, I'm going to get up because, and that means something to you. And that's why you do it. It could be, you could tell somebody and they could go, what? But it's meaningful to you. And that's what's so important about that part of the MORE framework, the meaning part of it.
Yeah, it makes sense. Like, before you're like, we all have a story, right? And we all have different reasons of why we do things and how we get into things. Especially with podcasting, right? Because you overcome your own story, then you kind of learn all of the tools that are necessary, and I feel like you're perfectly equipped to help the person that you once were. All right, so now you have an audience within that, and finding your purpose, which is about growth and service, right? It's being on that path every single day, making that progress. That's what I find is what it's all about, right? And health is a personalized process, and kind of along the lines of everyone wants to be like happy, right? Everyone wants to have that amazing life. I haven't met anyone who's like, no, I just want a chronic disease. Like it doesn't happen, right? So it's like, let's kind of go for what we want and keep on going.
Yeah, well, it's really fascinating that you're bringing up the word happy. And I know I brought up the word happy before because a lot of people, I want to be happy or whatever. Happiness, when you're thinking about the science, and again, I'm going back to Martin Seligman because he's such a heavyweight in positive psychology, is many years ago he wrote a book called Authentic Happiness. And then he kind of amended it about 10 years later and changed it to flourishing. Because happiness is fleeting. So I could ask you right now, Anthony, are you happy? And you could possibly say, yes, I am very happy. And then half an hour from now, I could ask you, are you happy? And maybe you got a bad text from somebody, or you got an email that had, quote, bad news in it. And you might say to me, nope, not happy at all right now. And so that's fleeting. So the word flourishing is a different way of looking at your life. You're looking at your life as a whole, and you're saying, do I feel like my life is worth living? Or if you're looking back on your past, do I feel like I have lived a life that was well lived? So that's the difference, that happiness is wonderful and smiley faces and all of that kind of thing. But it's not really to define in an entire life. You want to think about flourishing. Do I feel like I'm flourishing in my life? Because we're all going to have bad moments. We all are. People that are listening to this right now could be having a bad moment right now. So, trust me, it's going to be over. You're going to live through it. But that's what's a great distinction to make, is that we're not, we'd like to be happy, but we want to flourish, really. That's the more important part, is flourishing.
Exactly. Because, emotions are temporary, right? We have to be willing to be in the present moment and optimize our lives, right? Understand that it's all part of it. And we make that progress every single day. And, success is something that you attract by the person that you become, right? It's more so about who you become in that. And it's all about the process, right? It's about enjoying it and living in the flow. That's kind of along the lines of that too.
Yeah. You're hitting all the bullet points. It's wonderful. When you mentioned about being in the present moment, that when you think about Eastern philosophy, which if you're involved in martial arts, which I know that you are, there's a bit of the Eastern philosophy in there. And when you do it long enough, when you train long enough, you really start to understand a little bit more about the meditative qualities of this type of activity, and that it is an art and not a sport. But anyway, that being said, when you're thinking about those meditative qualities and trying to remain in the present moment, most people suffer either their past or they suffer the future. Now, the past is tied to depression, regrets, so on. The future is tied to anxiety. And, after the pandemic, and I said this to a lot of people when I talked to people just after the pandemic started, and then, obviously throughout the pandemic, every single person you talk to has a degree of anxiety now. Because at that time, we didn't know what was going to happen. So even the people that weren't anxious before the pandemic, they became anxious because we didn't know what was going to happen. So the reason I bring this up is people suffer two states, your past and your future, and they don't even exist. So here we are suffering things that don't exist. And that's why, and you hear these, cliche things. That's why the present is a present, because it's present, and most people are like, yeah, but how do I stay in the present? I still have to worry about my future. I still have to consider what happened in my past. And those are absolutely valid points. And actually, what happened in your past doesn't necessarily completely determine what happens in your future. It doesn't, because we don't know what's going to happen. But it determines how we imagine our future to be. Because we can only imagine our future based on what we've experienced before. So if we have negative things in our past, which I mentioned earlier that we're hardwired for negativity, so we hang on to those negative things. The stories that we tell ourselves tend to be negative. So we're hanging on to those things. So when we look forward, of course we're going to see things that are more negative because that's what we've experienced. So what I would suggest to people is, with your past, and I do it myself, I try to learn from those things that happened in my past. And I try to not dwell on them. I don't try not to regret. I try not to beat myself up because I was a different person then. But I try to take those stories and say, okay, now what can I do? Now how can I move forward with that? Because I want my future to be better. I want to be able to create a better future by learning from what happened in my past. Is that something that you can relate to? Is that something? Do you find things in your past that you've carried forward?
100%, yeah, because we've been carrying around this like stuck energy, right? And it's not until we kind of look at it and become aware of that and optimize it that we actually can get the gifts from it, as you mentioned, right? We have to be able to have this awareness of, like, maybe past trauma or whatever it is. Like, we have to kind of heal in a sense and get to the other side of it, right? Because if not, then everything works in synergy, right? Everything's going to affect something at some point. So you may be doing great, but you maybe have certain things you haven't addressed or uncovered, and I don't feel like you become the greatest version of you to actually do. So it all works together for sure.
Yeah. It's it's definitely it can be a very difficult thing for people to address things in their past, because it kind of floats back to what I said before about people taking things personally. We can only look at life from our own lenses, from our own perspective. We can't, and I mean that I'm not going to get into empathy, because empathy is being able to look at other people, look at their story and so on. And that's a practice also too. But the majority of people have difficulty with that because we're looking out our own eyes. This is our own experience. So as we talked about earlier, about being self-aware, when you just discover something, you can. Here's an example for me, and I just was able to get rid of this baggage that I carried forward from probably about almost 40 years ago. I had a friend of mine that she and I were roommates. We didn't part at the best, the best ways. I know I said some things to her that I felt bad about. She said some things that to me that I felt bad about and that I had, bad feelings. And I've been able to reconnect with this friend from 40 years ago. And we had a long discussion about it. It was actually Sunday that we had a long discussion about what had happened. And I had said, what I remember saying to her, and that I felt bad and so on about that. And she actually said to me, you know what, I don't even remember you saying that to me. And she goes, I'm sorry that you had to carry that around, but I don't remember you saying that to me. And I was like, well, I'm sorry I did say it to you, and I'm sorry that I did. And she was like, well, thank you, I appreciate that. And then she apologized for what she had said to me, and I was so grateful. And then we were able to start fresh. So sometimes we're able to do that if we know what it is or have a sense of what it is. And see, now what you should find really funny about that is that I felt bad about what I said to her, and she has no recollection of it. So but this is how it is. Well, if we didn't have this conversation recorded and you and I talked again 2 months from now, you would have a completely different memory of this conversation than I would have. So, and if we're open, we're able to both learn something from that, because I can go, wow, I didn't realize that he thought about that way. You know what I mean? So
Exactly.
that's part of what you were saying before about how do you move forward? How do you deal with some of these things that happened in your past and the work that it goes to? And a lot of people don't want to do the work. And I'm telling you right now, the work is worth it. You are doing the work for. To whoever's listening, you're worth it.
Absolutely. We have to acknowledge that, right? Because a lot of times we don't necessarily give ourselves permission to do everything that we want. We have to understand that self-care is so important. We have to optimize ourselves so we can actually show up the best version of ourselves. And we don't tend to be aware of that in many instances.
Yeah. It's this work that we're talking about. That's how we show up. As doing those things is how we show up. And sometimes people don't want to do it. They don't want to look deeply into the mirror because they don't want to think that maybe I was wrong. Maybe I shouldn't have done that way. Maybe I shouldn't have said that way. Maybe I didn't remember that story the right way. And that's really, I had another incident with another friend recently. Same thing. I remembered something that I thought was exchanged, and she had said to me, she goes, I would never say anything like that to you. And I actually had another friend that knew this friend of mine and had been kept in contact with her, said she would never say that to you. I said, well, that's what she said. And then talking to her, because I was like, okay, wait, maybe she didn't say that. I've learned enough about brain science that I was like, okay, I might be remembering this wrong. I need to drop my ego and my pride, and maybe I am remembering this wrong. And she was gracious enough to talk to me about it. And she said, I would never say that to you. And second, I think this is what happened. I think this might have been what happened. And we had a conversation, and I was like, you know what? You're right. It could have, because she may not have remembered it exactly the same way either, but we had a conversation about it. So I think part of it is just to be open and not be defensive, which I think happens to a lot of people. They get defensive because they think they're right. And sometimes being right is not the best way. I know. This happened to me recently.
Yeah, a lot of times we're carrying on these things and the person doesn't even remember. I've heard of that many times.
Right. It happens a lot. Like I've tried to ask my mother. My mother's 95 years old. And I've tried to ask my mother a lot of things about my childhood. Like, what do you remember about me? What is, and she's, not much, she's like, cause she's moved on. This is all she has is her present right now. So, sometimes we just don't remember things the same way, and that's okay. So that's another reason for letting it go. Maybe you're the only one who's hanging on to it. Maybe somebody else is not hanging on to it at all, obviously, because they
Right.
don't remember it.
Exactly. I mean, a lot of times we talk about forgiveness. Like forgiveness, it really comes down to, forgiving ourselves too, forgiving ourselves for anything we've been holding on to, and being willing to kind of understand that it's a process, but ultimately it's for you as well, right? Because it's about moving forward without holding on to these things and not necessarily expecting the other thing to kind of come out in balance. You don't have control over it, right? You can do what you can to influence it, but ultimately all you have is control over how you respond and your own actions, essentially.
Right. I love that you said that forgiveness is kind of for us. Actually, forgiveness is completely for the person who does the forgiving, because and this I can only when I say that, I mean that from a sense of, a lot of times when people are carrying a heavy burden and they need to forgive someone, either in a lot of cases that person is not with us anymore, the person that they need to forgive, because they may have been in your past, like parents. That happens a lot with parents, and children. Adult children are angry at their parents for whatever reason. I know I'm speaking from experience, because I was very, very angry with my father. Luckily for me, I was able to resolve some of those things while he was still here. And I know in some cases, a lot of people can't do that. Their parent has gone now, and they're still carrying this ill will, and that's eating you up. That's, what do they say? That's like giving rat poison to someone else, or to rat poison to yourself and thinking someone else is going to die. So
Right.
it's like, I need to forgive for me, whether the person is here or not. And I need to be able to say, and I'm saying this for anybody that's listening right now, everybody does the best they can do with what they have. And when they say something or do something to you that you didn't like or that hurt you, 99% of the time they didn't mean to do that, because they were carrying their own bags that they didn't deal with, and they're doing the best they can with what they have. So you can either choose to still stay angry and upset at that person and carry around that toxic rat poison yourself, and kill yourself instead of them, or you can just let it go. Because people that are upset like that, this is one thing that I used to say, and I still do actually now. Like, if you go into a retail establishment, say a grocery store, for example, and you do actually go through the line where somebody is waiting on you. So, because I know a lot of times people do the self-checkout, but say somebody's waiting on you, and say you're the person that's brand new that day, and they're having a really tough time. And then the person in line is upset about whatever, and they're annoyed that the person is brand new. They got to get to wherever they're getting to, and they get angry. I'm the person that's next in line that looks at that checkout person, the clerk, and says, "You're doing a great job today. Don't worry about that person. They're like that with everybody they know because they weren't hugged enough as a kid." So, people are like this because they haven't dealt with their bags. And so they tend to spill it out onto everybody else. So when you deal with your own bags and your own stuff, you interact much better with other people. And that's part of that forgiveness piece. If I'm upset with somebody and I choose to forgive them, whether I tell them or not, I'm letting it go for myself. And I'm able to move on. And what goes back to what we talked about earlier. What can I learn from that? Why am I doing that to myself? Why is it that I'm beating myself up over this?
Yeah. I mean, how we interact with the world is really how we interact with ourselves, right?
Right. Well, you have to wonder, like, why is it? What am I doing? Am I don't know, trying to have a martyr syndrome or something? I don't know. This is a question you have to ask yourself. Why are you doing that?
Yeah. All right, Jan, it's been awesome. I really appreciate you today for coming on and sharing your story with us and how we can actually take control of our minds, right? As we talked a lot about kind of inner workings of how we interact with reality, right? And there's so much we can do. We can learn from our own experiences, like martial arts is great, learning all tools of wellness, health coaching, all these things. But ultimately, it really comes down to making those high quality decisions on a day to day basis, having an altruistic mindset, like wanting to be of service, right? And trusting the process and understanding all you have is right now. And there's so much we can do, so much we can become and experience. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been wonderful. I appreciate
Yeah.
it.
If we want to get connected with you and all your work, where can we go for that?
How can people find me? My website, I have selfcaresensei.com. I have a book, Strive for More. It's on Amazon, actually, and if you just Google Strive for More, Jan Raeder, what well-being really means and how you can achieve it, it's available in a lot of places to buy. And anybody that's listening, if you do buy the book, I'd love to hear your feedback on the book, because that's how we move the conversation forward. So that's really that. And I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Instagram, I'm on Facebook. I'm on Facebook at Self Care Sensei, and we do that every Wednesday, What Went Well Wednesday. So I would love to have people get involved in that, because the more people we are, when we lift up the algorithm, it's better for everybody. So hopefully people will get involved in that.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.